Why is the Cooper Cup signing good for Jackson Smith and Jibga? That more this week on the couch. Got Ryan Heath from Fantasy Points joining us this week to sort through this. Starting out with the biggest signing of the second week of free agency, Cooper Cup to the Seahawks. Good for Jackson Smith and Jigba, Ryan?
Yeah, I think so. And there's a couple reasons for this. The biggest being that I think Cooper Cup is just kind of washed at this point. If you look from week 12 on, we have a metric over at Fantasy Points Data called average separation score, where basically all of our film charters watch every single route. They grade the level of separation that the receiver attained on it, and it all averages out into a nice little score for us that just shows how well the receiver is winning on all of his routes, right? But from week 12 on, Cup ranked only 51st of 69 qualifying wide receivers in that metric. It was also just very visible if you were watching the Rams playoff run. Like, Cup just kind of didn't have it down the stretch. So I think adding him in to the Seattle offense, letting him kind of run all of the shallower routes, like getting into the slot, running all of that stuff, is going to open up JSN to run more of the downfield routes, right? This is what we have been screaming for JSN for 2 years is please God, let him run on the outside and let him win downfield. All of those same average separation score metrics for JSN are great, especially on those deeper routes. He just hasn't been able to run a lot of them over the first 2 years of his career with DK Metcalf there, especially. But now, kind of in this new look Kubiak offense, we could see JSN just take on all these deeper shot routes. He can be in the Rashid Shaheed role,
Right.
essentially. So, yeah, I'm pretty excited about kind of this new look Seattle offense with JSN maybe operating downfield some more. I really like kind of just this match of skill players that they've assembled here.
Yeah, the dank stats, as Scott Barrett would put it, give us insight and a lot of great data visualizations too. But they give us insight. I even saw there's the hot and cold zones in terms of efficiency, but then there's the hot and cold zones in terms of volume, and those weren't matching up for Jackson Smith and Jigba, and now they can. And let's go one step further about the new look Seattle offense, because I think you all have some stuff too on alignment between Sam Darnold and Derek Carr, or alignment between the Clint Kubiak offense and Sam Darnold. Because on the surface, and look, the reality is that both of these things can be right over the course of the season, right? Seattle's offensive line and Sam Darnold seeing ghost can make this a disaster. But Clint Kubiak's offense and Jackson Smith and Jigba and what Clint Kubiak's offense asks of a quarterback and how it sets a quarterback up for success can also create some good results. And we saw this with the Saints. They had the most efficient offense by a good margin for the first two games, and then some different things started to break down. But what do you see that Derek Carr did or was asked to do that potentially sets up Sam Darnold for success?
Yeah, so I guess before I get into this, the first obvious disclaimer is that, yeah, the Saints had this massively efficient offense the first few weeks of the season. When it started to break down, wasn't actually like when Derek Carr got hurt or when their skill players got hurt. It was when the interior of the offensive line started breaking down,
Yeah.
right? So, right off the bat, disclaimer, that could be a very big issue in Seattle in practice. But in theory, I love this fit. So play action is probably the biggest kind of feature of this Kubiak offense. And we saw Sam Darnold be very successful on play action with the Vikings last year. Fifth best yards per attempt average for Darnold on play action, 9.7, pretty much the same as Derek Carr last year. He was fourth best, right? Similarly, Darnold really likes to throw downfield on play action. It's the same thing we saw with Carr. Darnold had the fifth highest play action deep throw rate, where Carr had the third highest. So, yeah, it's a really good stylistic fit. We just in general in the NFL, we see these, like I call them McShanahan style
Mm-hmm.
systems, right? The McVay or Shanahan coaching tree kind of with all of these efficiency hacks that they do. This system is just taken over the NFL, right? In terms of fantasy points per dropback, 5 out of the top 10 quarterbacks in fantasy points per dropback last year were just pocket passers on one of these McShanahan offenses. It was basically the five of them, Jared Goff, and then the four hypermobile guys with Daniels, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, and Josh Allen. So that's what it takes to be a QB1 in fantasy, essentially, is either you're hypermobile or you're in one of these systems, like Sam Darnold is now still in with Clint Kubiak. So, yeah, I like it from a stylistic perspective. Again, could be very kind of boom bust on a play to play or a week to week basis, depending on how the offensive line holds up. But yeah, this keeps Darnold like in the conversation. For me at least, as a fantasy asset, I would say like I'm more comfortable, I think, in Dynasty going to a JJ McCarthy, just because over with Kevin O'Connell, excuse me, we've seen more quarterbacks succeed in this system, right? We've seen Nick Mullins, we've seen Josh Dobbs put up QB1 fantasy numbers. I have no doubt JJ McCarthy can do the same thing. The Vikings roster top to bottom is just a lot better. But yeah, I think kind of everybody can win here in this QB carousel that we've had with McCarthy, with Darnold, and with Geno going to the Raiders.
Yeah, if the teams are rational, if they see the players for who they really are, and as we keep talking about the Clint Kubiak offense, at least for the short term, it seemed like it took early in the season. So maybe file away that maybe early in the season Seattle will have the drop on the opponents. But since you brought up Minnesota, we're going to kind of do a carousel of all the different players and the fallout from these different moves. Interesting to see also in the second week of free agency and reading beat writers. And I think Matthew Berry, I want to give a nod to Matthew Berry because in his 25 things he heard at the combine, he mentioned the potential trade of Jordan Mason. And then David Lombardi has been hinting that that there was interest in Jordan Mason. And then whenever the 49ers, who were in a cash poor kind of situation, they put the second round tender on Jordan Mason, David Lombardi said, oh, this could be setting up a trade. Teams aren't going to give a second round pick, not going to sign Jordan Mason to an offer sheet, but some team may want to trade for him. And here enter stage left the Vikings, who already had re-signed Aaron Jones right before the beginning of senior free agency. They give up, couch cushion change in terms of draft capital, a bump from a 6th to a 5th and a 6th, but they also invest in Jordan Mason. Do you think that, I shouldn't say do you think that because it's clear. Kevin Seifert did a good job breaking down the signings, not just of Jordan Mason and Aaron Jones, but of Will Freeze. They've gotten their offensive line improved, specifically in the running game. Do you think it's going to take, though, do you think we're going to see a more balanced, in a consequential way for fantasy football, a much more balanced offense, especially in the red zone, than we saw last year in Minnesota?
So in the red zone, yes, I can definitely buy that. I think we generally see teams in the red zone. You're always dealing with a smaller sample there when you're looking at red zone pass rates. I'd be pretty confident that that's not just going to be top 3 the entire season. Though to be fair, in pretty much the entire O'Connell tenure, the Vikings have been a top 3, top 5 pass rate team, both overall and in the red zone. So yes, we see the personnel moves that could signal a more balanced approach, but I don't know. I sometimes tend to think that these coaches just are who they are and kind of do what they want to do. So if you expect something in between like a top 5 pass rate and like a more balanced like top 12 pass rate, maybe that's more of like an average expectation that's decent. But yeah, I would still expect the Vikings to be at least like a top 10 team by pass rate over expectation this year. The move is interesting to me though, because I guess I also read like the Matthew Berry combine article with that Jordan Mason rumor, and it stuck out to me too. Part of me almost didn't believe it because I was like, are NFL teams really this high on Jordan Mason that they're willing to not just pay like second round tender money rather than just drafting their own day 2 running back in this amazing draft class? But yeah, just what Jordan Mason did on the field, both to my eyes and to the metrics, compared to what we saw someone like Isaac Garendo just step in and do honestly a degraded and more injured version of the same offense. yeah, I was just a little surprised that I guess the league opinion of Jordan Mason was so high. I think it makes sense for Minnesota. Like that was kind of their issue all of last season is they want Aaron Jones in a bell cow role in the beginning of the year. He's kind of showing these like 70-80% opportunity shares. And we always get really excited anytime Aaron Jones does that, but it never seems to last, right? They're bringing in Cam Akers and giving Cam
Right.
Akers touches, which is never something you want to see. So, yeah, I think it makes sense for Minnesota to add to this backfield. Jordan Mason is a perfectly fine runner to kind of throw in there that honestly also protects like Aaron Jones's fantasy value to a decent degree. I think they're a lot less likely to add like a running back of consequence in the
Right.
draft that is going to be would potentially have been a bigger threat to him as the season wore on. So yeah, fantasy wise, I kind of think everybody wins there in Minnesota, but really the biggest winner to me there in that whole transaction is Isaac Guerrero. I mean, in his 3 starts, 17.4 fantasy points per game, above an 11% target share, top 8 at the position in yards per out run. Like, I think Guerrero really just, if we're talking about a Christian McCaffrey substitute or like a Christian McCaffrey backup, I think he really just fits better with what the Niners want to do than Mason does because he's an actual threat in the passing game. A lot of the 49ers offense is kind of constituted on having all of these players that can perform multiple roles. Obviously, that's kind of McCaffrey's special gift is that he's a running back that can run routes like a wide receiver and actually beat defenders like a wide receiver with real routes, right? Guerrero's not quite at that level, but certainly closer than a Jordan Mason. He doesn't come into the game and immediately just gunk up everything they're trying to do, right? So, yeah, I'm a fan of the move from like a team fit perspective on both sides, but I'm really like don't want it to go unnoticed that Guerrero is in the RB2 role right now. The 49ers draft a running back every single year. You
Right.
just have to
Right.
accept that. But I mean that is keeping his price down right now in dynasty leagues. He is still completely affordable. You can pay an early third for Isaac Guerrero right now, and I love that. He's been one of my favorite buys all offseason, continues to be.
Yeah, I think that I love you say right now, and I mean the graveyard of Kyle Shanahan mid-round running back picks. Isaac Guerrero could end that streak, but we're probably gonna have another one in this year's draft. And Guerrero did get hurt twice last year, so it could be. And I guess we may measure their concern about Guerrero's durability long term by how high they take a running back. But I think I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like even if they take a running back, that's all the more reason to get in on Guerrero because his value will be down. But like you said, he showed through the metrics. And one thing I do want to point out, Kevin Seifert pointed this out, what Jordan Mason adds specifically is yards after contact. And that's what the Vikings have been really deficient in. I think he said all running backs over 150 carries during Mason's career, he has the highest yards after contact per carry. So, Mason's going to give them a more rugged presence in the backfield, and he's good in blitz pickup too. Last part of this whole merry-go-round of Seattle and Minnesota, and let's bring in the Rams here and Davante Adams, because you bring up how Cooper Kupp was falling off a cliff at the end of the year. Last week, when I had Bob Harris on, I just opened with an open-ended question: what's the most important or most consequential move in the first week of free agency for fantasy? He said Davante Adams to the Rams, and it sounds like we may be underestimating how good Davante Adams can be with the Rams because we're not understanding how bad Cooper Kupp was with the Rams last year.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it's kind of perfect here because just from a volume perspective, the Rams have always been this incredibly condensed offense just between Kupp and Nakua, like combining for 70% plus of the team's targets. So we know that Adams can just kind of slide right into Kupp's role from a volume perspective, which is nice, right? So last year, Adams averaged 17 fantasy points per game on just under a 35% first read target share. Kupp was at about a 32% first read target share with the Rams last year. So, yeah, I'm not like concerned that Adams is going to be stealing from Nakua or anything like
No,
that. It's just, yeah, it's great. They both can be insanely productive. And specifically, we're thinking of Adams in the cup role. If he's moving into the slot, Adams was great in the slot last year with the Jets. They played him there quite a bit. He was top 10 in yards per out run from the slot after he joined them, 2.19 yards per out run. So, yeah, I just have no problem projecting Adams as like a mid-range to high-end wide receiver two, kind of at worst, and going from there. So, yeah, we're just very, very happy here in fantasy. I think honestly, just overall, there haven't been that many like huge losers to free agency. And I'm sure I'll be saying the total opposite after the draft because it feels like we're on way too much of a high right now with like no fantasy players like having their dreams crushed. Like it doesn't feel real to me. Like I am just seeing the optimistic side of like all of these moves right now.
And I wrote an article some years back. I should have revived it about why optimism is a fantasy football skill or plus or trait that will help you, because I think that outliers, Scott Barrett and I have talked about this a ton, outliers win championships, I know that there's a lot of really, really good people, outstanding, brilliant minds in the fantasy football space that advise us how to stack up 55-45 bets. And you stack up enough 55-45 bets, and cumulatively, especially if you're playing high volume, you're going to win. But to have the vision to see the potential outliers, you have to let the optimism run free inside of you to see both this and this and this all line up, than something that we haven't seen before. Because you bring up Devontae Adams, and I think this is something that's counterintuitive for people, but like you said, this Sean McVay offense, Matthew Stafford's back. The Rams have always had the super concentrated offense. There's no reason that Puka Nacua and Devontae Adams can't both be top 10 receivers for fantasy. And what's going to be interesting to watch, something I spend a lot of time looking at now, Ryan, is ADP year over year, right? So Devontae Adams, now remember, Devontae Adams started out last year with Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell as projected quarterbacks, and he was still going in the second round. He was still a second round pick last year. Now, the second round of last year's fantasy drafts was really more like a typical third round. There was kind of a hole between the first round quality guys and the third round quality guys. At least it felt that way going into the drafts in the summer. Devontae Adams, I believe, in early underdog drafts was about number 50. That's a massive drop from the second round. That's like 1/3 of the value. That's the bottom dropping out of his value. So I think even if people process, oh, this is good for Devontae Adams, he probably won't get back up into the second round. But he's in a better situation than he was when he was going in the second round last year. And like you said with Puka Nacua, you might say, well, now there's someone for him to share targets with. No, Puka's going to be fine. Remember, Puka's coming into last year hurt. So yeah, lift off for the Rams offense. Let's touch on a couple of more. Well, actually, since you brought it up, give me another player situation or something else too, because let's stay in the happy unicorns and rainbows zone here, optimism. Tell me a few other things that really stood out to you so far in free agency that made you feel really optimistic about the future.
Yeah, so this one's kind of weird and maybe not like as immediately exciting, but I really like the fit for Christian Kirk going to the Texans because they kind of have this target vacuum, especially underneath, where down the stretch last year they were relying on guys like Robert Woods and John Mechie to go out there and get like a 15% target per out run rate just in a cardboard cutout fashion, like kind of any replacement level NFL player. They were just running out there. So I like Kirk to just step in there, get like a 20 to 22% target share immediately, because that's kind of what Christian Kirk does, right? But also just thinking about the team and the overall environment. Yes, there's very little target competition underneath. Tank Dell likely to miss all of 2025, but even bigger, the Texans just don't have an offensive line now. They ship off Laramie Tunsil. They ship off multiple other starters. And again, not that the Texans offensive line was anything to write home about last year. It was easily the biggest problem on their offense, but they've just completely cleaned house personnel wise. This is not a good offensive line draft. It's certainly not a good tackle draft, right? So I would expect the Texans line to be really bad again in 2025. And with that, I just kind of think of like the 2024 Miami Dolphins approach to the offensive line,
Yeah.
right? Which is we acknowledge we don't have one, so we're not going to have a real running game, and our entire passing game is just going to be all of these short throws, all of these screens, all this design stuff to kind of get around the fact that we can't pass protect or let anything develop downfield. This is why you see Jonnu Smith and Devon Achane outproducing Tyreek Hill through the air. So we could see maybe a version of that in Houston with Christian Kirk just benefiting from like this total PPR scam. And maybe Nico Collins taking like not maybe not like a step back, but not being like the Tyreek Hill levels of efficiency and having all of these downfield shots every single week. Yeah, that's just kind of what I look at when I
Hmm.
see the Texans roster and think about how is this likely to play out. And yeah, it's very surprisingly, it just kind of all benefits Christian Kirk, at least in my mind right now.
Right. I call it the struggle target. Who's the struggle target? Who's the target when the offense is struggling? And it sure seems like it's going to be Christian Kirk. It's funny too because you've already mentioned the McShanahan tree, and they've gone from Shanahan to Mick, with Bobby Slowick taking the fall for the offensive line woes, and they bring in Nick Caley from Sean McVay's staff. We'll see. It's funny too to watch teams. One of the things I really like about free agency, Ryan, is I like to say teams can't lie in the draft and they can't lie in free agency. They're really telling us what they value, what they think they need, how they think you win football games. And it was really funny to see the Texans ship off Kenyon Green for admittedly a good player, Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. I mean, a player that's going to. I mean, now you look at the Texans secondary; they lock up Derek Stingley. They've got some players there. They've got a really good secondary, and you marry that to Will Anderson and Danielle Hunter, and yeah, I mean that's the strength of the team. They ship off Kenyon Green. Of course, the Eagles are happy to pick up Kenyon. They've got Jeff Stoutland. You know, of course, the Eagles are going to make Kenyon Green into the first round pick that he never was with the Texans. So they turn around and they trade for Ed Ingram. And as we mentioned earlier in the show, the Vikings, and they got Ryan Kelly too. So the Vikings said, well, we have to improve our interior offensive line. They jettisoned Ed Ingram, but the Texans don't have Jeff Stoutland. They don't have Bill Callahan. I don't know how this is going to work out for the Texans. Like you're saying, there's going to be some turbulence, and it's the Texans, the Seahawks. We already mentioned these are teams that are potentially the story of 2025 for them could be, well, if the offensive line isn't there, then it doesn't matter what you're trying to do. It doesn't matter what changes you wanted to make. They're not going to take root. So sometimes projecting the worst case scenario for an offense can lead you to the right answer, which could be Christian Kirk. Since you mentioned Christian Kirk, let's talk about somebody else that the Jags jettisoned this offseason. They were going to cut Christian Kirk. They got a late round pick for him. They did just straight up cut Evan Ingram. And Evan Ingram gets picked up with the Broncos. And in a kind of universe winking at us, the Joker, well, the real Joker is actually Sean Payton, because we're still waiting. We're still waiting to see who can be this player in the offense. Evan Ingram doesn't fit the Joker in the sense of the guys we've thought of in the past, because he's not that physically talented. But you did point out that his targets per route run was very high with the Jags. Now, I'm curious how you think that could affect how we project the Broncos' usage of Evan Ingram, but also I'm curious if you think that should be something we consider when we look at Brenton Strange, who James Gladstone, also coming out of the Rams system, seems very high on. So let's talk about Ingram with the Broncos, and then maybe what's in the wake of Ingram's departure in Jacksonville.
Yeah, so I agree that Ingram is not really a joker in the traditional sense. For a joker, you want a guy that can perform multiple jobs like at the level of a more specialized player, right? That's not Evan Ingram in terms of run blocking, right? That is not what you want Ingram doing, lining up in line, right? What you do want Ingram doing, to compare him to another Sean Payton tight end, is maybe more of like a Kobe Fleener role, right? So he can split out, he can be a mismatch against linebackers and safeties, and he can kind of again come like a Kobe Fleener, maybe not be at like that 75-80% route share, but be on the field for 65-ish% of the routes, have a high target per route run on those, that can be a low end tight end one, especially with the lack of other target competition, right? So yeah, I like Engram there. I don't think Joker is like necessarily the correct term to use. And like my only fear is that Sean Payton like just ultra trolls us and
Yeah,
still drafts like Colston Loveland and says that, well, now this is my Joker. This is a, because they do kind of play different positions, Loveland and Engram, right? To the point where I'm still a little bit scared there. I'm hoping they go running back in round one. It would keep O'Marion Hampton away from Jalen Warren and the Steelers. Like that would be the best thing for everybody, is if the
right.
Broncos just go running back at 20 overall. In terms of fantasy, that's the dream at least. But yeah, cool with Engram there. With Brenton Strange, yeah, this one's interesting to me because I'm always going to be a little bit scared of a player that is a holdover from a previous regime having a role opened up for him that we perceive, at least, right? My immediate natural reaction to the Jags and Gladstone signing Hunter Long and Johnny Munt is, okay, well, there is not like a true receiving tight end here. We saw Brenton Strange basically play that Evan Ingram role, especially down the stretch last year when the Jags were very wanting for pass catchers. Yeah, this could be Brenton Strange. He was a waiver wire ad in Dynasty, like in week 2 or week 3 last year. Perfect. He might have just walked into a starting role in 2025. He also might not have, right?
Yeah,
This regime could have no cares at all for Brenton Strange. That is absolutely also possible. They could also draft a tight end to play that pass catching role, or the offense could not really be designed around the tight end much at all. We remember with Liam Cohn, Cade Otton had that like 4-week heater where everyone else on the offense was hurt, and Liam Cohn's like, all right, I guess we're gonna run this passing game around Cade Otton, and he's gonna go from like a 12% target per out run player to like a 28% player because we're just gonna force it his way, and it kind of worked. And then as soon as Mike Evans was back, it was over, right? And it's like, oh, Cade Otton is still Cade Otton. So yeah, I do wonder, like before we've even seen Brenton Strange like in Liam Cohn's offense, we're already like assigning the best version of the Cade Otton usage to him is probably not what we want to be doing. But yeah, I mean he's Strange as a hold to me at
hmm
the very least. Or yeah, I don't know. I don't know that he's viewed as like a top 10 dynasty tight end right now, but if you get that type of price, you should be immediately selling is how I would view it. So yeah, that's kind of all my thoughts
hmm
on Jaguars tight ends and former Jaguars tight ends.
right. The Gladstone said a lot of nice things about a role for Strange that he hasn't had before. But also, it sounds like Gladstone said a lot of nice things about De'Ami Brown and what
Yeah.
they thought about him. So yeah, and that's what I mean. Hopefully, you want a GM, especially a new GM, that is making moves to be excited about the players, to be optimistic about the players. That doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily live up to that optimism. I guess we got to touch on the other big news of the week, which is Cincinnati locking up Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. And I guess the way I'm going to serve this up to you, Ryan, do you have any opinions about team building and this line of thought that this just isn't going to work, having this much money tied up on 2 wide receivers and a quarterback? It's just very foolish, and there's no other similar team that we can point to. Do you think that kind of analysis is valid? Do you think it's something that we should consider when we look at this development?
I think it can be valid, but I think I disagree. So I think the instant urge that we all have, like as ball knowers, we want to show everybody on our Twitter feeds that we know ball and we know what we're talking about. Is, well, no, you cannot build an offense like this. This isn't fantasy football. You got to build from the interior. You got to build to the edge rushers. Like, just show everyone that your team building philosophy is like very hard nosed. It's not like fantasy football. This is totally different, right? And I do think that's where a lot of that sentiment kind of comes from a little bit that we've been seeing this week. The way I look at it is really, along with tackle and edge rusher, quarterback and wide receiver are two of the 4 most valuable, most important positions in football, both from like an on-field impact perspective and the perspective of how hard is it to sign stars at that position in free agency, right? We we don't really see genuine star quarterbacks, edge rushers, tackles, or wide receivers make it to free agency. So if you're going to lock up cap space on any of those premium positions, I'm usually going to be for it. And not just because they're the most important positions, but because you are going to be getting a discount, especially in the later years of those deals, right?
Mm.
3 years from now, T. Higgins' average annual value is going to be well below market for a comparable wide receiver that you would sign in free agency in 2027, if there even are any comparable wide
Right.
receivers in 2027, right? And there likely won't be. There weren't at all this year. It was the market was, wow, maybe Higgins won't get tagged, and that will be one of the best free agent receivers we've seen in years, right? It just doesn't really happen. So I do like this move for them. It doesn't necessarily mean that they can't sign edge rushers, that they can't re-sign Hendrickson, that they can't get anything done there. I mean, I really hate when people say the salary cap is fake, because that like glosses over so much of the minutia and like interesting management and strategies that teams can use to maximize the cap. The Bengals as a team generally aren't able to do that because they are not generally willing to front a lot of the money in terms of signing bonuses or hold it in escrow, just because that ownership group is very cash poor. So it is harder for the Bengals to kind of spend and win everywhere, right? But that is going to be the case whether you're signing an edge rusher or whether you're signing T. Higgins, right? And again, like I said, Higgins now is cheaper than he was going to be, or a comparable receiver would be 2 or 3 years from now. So I support the move. I like that they did it. I only wish that they had done it last offseason,
Sure.
right? That's really the only like the biggest criticism that I could give. Yeah, a team generally is not going to win with just a quarterback and two wide receivers and nothing of note on the defense, like at all. But yeah, they're just like any other team. They're going to have to hit on some draft picks on defense. They're going to have to find some cheap talent. That can be said of pretty much every successful team, of every Super Bowl winning team. Like the Buccaneers Super Bowl team a couple years ago, they hit on all of those day two picks on defense. The Eagles have been drafting incredibly for the last 5 to 10 plus years. Yeah, they have to hit on their draft picks, but them foregoing signing T. Higgins doesn't make that any more likely either. So yeah, I like this move. I like that they locked up Higgins and Chase.
Yeah, I think that really they had no choice if they were going to be serious about winning, and it should help them have an opportunity, increase the opportunity to keep Trey Hendrickson, because it shows they're serious about winning. And from a team building perspective, I was talking about this yesterday with Doug McCrae on his show. You make strengths stronger. That's how balance. Come on. How many Super Bowl champions can we look at and say, oh, they won because of balance? They won because they were among the top 10 teams on both sides of the ball. No, they built around their strengths. They made their strengths stronger. And the Bengals had a terrible defense. They had offensive line woes. Every break went against them last year, and they still won 9 games. And if one or two breaks go their way, they make the playoffs, and they would have been very dangerous in the playoffs. I think that we would have given them a puncher's chance against any Kansas City, Buffalo, Baltimore, absolutely. So they're not as far away as it seems. And yeah, I like your analysis there. That hey, in this case, and I like narrowing it down to these four positions because it makes sense to me, Ryan, because those are the four positions that can make plays that are the swing the expected win percent, whatever win probability, the most. A sack, fumble, or preventing, creating a stable pocket for a downfield pass, reeling in that pass, throwing that pass. These are the plays that decide the game in the end. And with Chase and Higgins, it's exciting. I think from a fantasy football perspective, it's really exciting to see what these guys can do now that everybody's happy, because I think you saw Lamar Jackson really spread his wings once he felt like the Ravens had his back and were going to build the team around him. And I think we may see a similar emotional, spiritual bump. Rounding out a couple of things from free agency that I thought you pointed out that deserve some more attention. you isolated very well why Josh Palmer made sense for Buffalo. And this might not be a big consequential move for fantasy. I mean, it may help Josh Allen a little bit, but he's already quarterback one. He's going to stay quarterback one. But he does fill a hole in this offense. This isn't just interchangeable. Why do you think the Bills did the right thing specifically? Hey, I know you said it wasn't a great wide receiver class in free agency. They got one of the best wide receivers in free agency. Why is Josh Palmer going to help them?
Yeah. I mean, to start this off, it's almost never a great wide receiver class in free agency, right? It's a really hard position to fill via free agency because generally, when a team drafts a good wide receiver, they extend him because, yeah, it's a really valuable position. The great guys don't generally get to free agency. So, yeah, with that like context in mind, you look at a Josh Palmer and it's okay, what is there any like very specific skill that he can add to this receiving room, right? And in the case of the Bills, I think he can, right? Josh Palmer can win against man coverage much better than any receiver the Bills had last season. And that shows up in all of our average separation score metrics, where Palmer is like a fringe top 10, top 15 separator specifically against man coverage. And also downfield is kind of where he's best. So, like on these go routes, on these post routes, that's where he's doing all the winning. Now, to be clear, and this is kind of like a debate I'm really tired of having in terms of like, does Josh Palmer's separation matter for fantasy? No, it probably doesn't, right? Because the way Palmer separates is on these downfield routes. He's more of like a field stretcher archetype that kind of opens things up for an offense. You want that in real life on an NFL offense, but Palmer is not the guy that is going to run slants the entire game and get 3 or 4 screen targets for the PPR points and put like just command this massive target share. That's not like the type of receiver he is or who he is, right? It's not the fantasy friendly archetype of wide receiver. So yeah, I like it for the Bills just as a skill set match in terms of real life. But yeah, I'm not like out over my skis for Josh Palmer in fantasy or anything. But yeah, it's really hard. I think people, especially this time of year, we kind of have it's fun to do like real quote unquote real football analysis, right? Because it's fantasy drafts are, aside from like the super sicko best ball and dynasty stuff, all that's months away. Like let's be NFL pundits. Let's talk about this right now, right? It's fun for us fantasy guys to kind of flex our muscles and do something a little bit different. But yeah, I do think it's important and it's difficult because I think a lot of people like follow me, follow us, follow fantasy people just like to get the answers for fantasy. So it's hard to like always express like my analysis is about real life, or it's very limited to in this specific way to like this is not me saying to like click this guy's name in the 6th round of your fantasy draft or whatever, right?
Yeah, well, what it shows is again, Buffalo is has clear eyes for what's missing in their wide receiver group, and they correctly identified who among the free agent wide receivers would be worth their investment. And if you look at what Gabe Davis got from Jacksonville and how Gabe Davis performed, and you look at Josh Palmer, and you see that with the inflation of wide receiver salaries, that's a discount. He's a younger player. And when you think of Gabe Davis winning on the edge downfield, it's with these contested catches. Maybe Josh Palmer won't have to do that, making Josh Allen's life a little bit easier. So, if anything, it just tells us that the Bills continue to make rational actions as a good organization. But like you said, I mean, we're talking about look, all fantasy takes are based on actual football takes anyway. Though I suppose the only part of fantasy analysis that's not based on football, and I'm not trying to downplay the importance of this, is understanding the fantasy football hive mind. And that's probably one of the most important things, because when it comes right down to it, fantasy advice is going to be based on where the conventional wisdom about a player, about a team, about a situation, we think is off, either too optimistic or too pessimistic, and how to take advantage of that. So that's a really important part of the equation. But how do we decide that they're too optimistic or too pessimistic? It circles back to our football analysis. Okay, before we go off the rails here in a few minutes, you wrote a really awesome piece about the combine that I think is interesting, partially because I love the fact that if you read it, you see there's no easy answer. There's no easy overarching answer about athleticism and predicting outcomes, and also because you invoke Adam Harstad, because that's always good. But what I thought was really interesting, and you did a really good job, you segmented this out by position, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. And even within positions, you segmented it out sometimes by different archetypes, tall wide receivers and short wide receivers and so on. What I thought was really interesting, and I want you to unpack this for people, is that athleticism, overall athleticism, is actually a negative indicator for wide receiver. But it sounds counterintuitive, but the way you explained it makes sense to me.
Yeah. So before I get into this, I just, as with anything, I always want to give credit to Adam Harstad in any time that I can. So Harstad explained this probably better than I ever will be able to years ago. So yeah, shout out Adam Harstad for kind of explaining this in terms of Bergson's paradox. But yeah, you're right. So if you control for draft capital, so an easy way to do that is just to say day one wide receivers, day two wide receivers, and day three wide receivers. The more athletic a receiver is, measured by, I have a metric with Scott Barrett that we collaborate on called Spork. That's just an overall like athleticism composite number or 40 time or however you want to do it. Within a day of the draft, the more athletic a wide receiver is, the lower his peak fantasy production is within his first 3 seasons. So athleticism and fantasy production are negatively correlated at the wide receiver position. And there's a pretty clear reason for that, just if you look at what NFL teams like to do, which is overdraft these kind of field stretcher archetypes of wide receivers that ran extremely fast 40 times and didn't maybe have all that much college production, weren't these like huge, massive producers in college. The easy example this year is Matthew Golden, right? Super fast, guy that can win downfield on the outside, stretch out an offense, but was never really a huge target earner at the college level, wouldn't expect him to be so at the NFL level, and therefore wouldn't expect him to be that amazing of a fantasy producer, right? So we see kind of the Matthew Goldens of the world get pushed up the draft boards, right, in real life. And because of that, on average, just the most athletic wide receivers at any area of the draft are less qualified, so to speak, in every other aspect of the wide receiver position, right? So maybe their route running isn't as good. Maybe they aren't as big. Maybe they aren't as good as at contested catches. Whatever wide receiver trait you want to point to, they are probably comparatively lacking in that, where their biggest skill is just the speed, right, or the athleticism. So that kind of, yeah, it creates this negative correlation where the guys who are good enough to be drafted in round one without being hyper athletic are probably these awesome target earners, right? And it's just this misalignment of what the NFL is selecting for, which is athleticism, is helping a team in real life in stretching out the field, versus what we as fantasy managers should be selecting for, which is just guys who earn volume, guys who get targets, guys who score PPR points. So that's not to say like if a wide receiver is really athletic, it means you shouldn't like him automatically. Like recently, Ted McMillan ran. I don't know if we've even decided what Ted McMillan actually ran yet, but a 4.48 to a 4.55, depending on who you ask. But at his size, a 4.48 would be pretty extraordinary. But it almost doesn't matter to me at all, right? Because Ted McMillan's production is what it is. His profile on the field is what it is. If a team thinks he's a 4.48 or a 4.55, maybe that's the difference between him getting drafted 20th overall or 10th overall. But it doesn't make Tet as a player, as a target earner, really any different to me or to fantasy managers, right? So that's I guess that's kind of a decent like
Hmm.
example case to think of here.
Yeah, and I think to distill it down to something actionable, controlling for situation, because situation can make all the difference here. But if, let's assume for a second, two wide receivers are drafted in the same part of the draft, and the situation is similar. If one has a very high SPORK or relative athletic score, shout out to Kent Lee Platt, and one doesn't, take the one who doesn't, because it's like you said, Adam Harstad laid this out pretty straightforward. I would make the dichotomy of skills and traits. You know, there's skills and there are traits. And and when you see two players drafted similarly and one has more traits and one has more skill, like if one has lesser traits, that must mean necessarily that they have better skills. And generally the NFL underestimates the ability of those skills to translate or overestimates their ability to bring those traits to bear. Or it's also possible that speed and stretching the defense, giving the offense more speed to work, more space to work, is something that doesn't necessarily show up on that player's fantasy stats. So, I don't want to take away too much from the tactical value speed wide receivers. It just doesn't translate to fantasy. Now, but you do reassure us that for running back and for tight end, athleticism still matters. How can we use athleticism to get an edge when we're looking at drafting running backs and tight ends?
Yeah, so at the running back position, the biggest thing is you just want the outlier guys that are like a 90th percentile or higher in terms of athleticism. If you get a 90th percentile or better athlete that goes in round one, we do see better average outcomes for them early in their career in terms of fantasy production, even compared to other round one running backs that are in, say, the 50th percentile of athleticism, right? So, and I mean, luckily for us, this year we had I think a record 6 running backs at the combine score above a 90th percentile SPORK score in our model for us. So the guys that could go round one in there would be Omarion Hampton and Quinshawn Judkins would be the names to watch. There in terms of they are like these incredible athletes that are to an outlier degree to maybe where the NFL underestimates it a little bit, or it just directly translates to more fantasy production. But kind of outside of like the outlier guys at the top end, it flattens out, right? There's not that much difference to me between like an 80th percentile athletic running back or a 50th percentile. Like I don't really care that Caleb Johnson runs like a 4.57 versus if he ran like a 4.51. Like just at his weight and size, the outcomes for those speed scores are not that different. So yeah, I think two kind of edges there is like, yeah, target the hyper athletic guys, but don't like split hairs between, oh, it's a 4.57 or a 4.5. Like it, as long as they kind of meet a minimum threshold of like they're going to get drafted on day 2, like you're fine at the running back position, right? With tight ends, it's even more important, I would say, just overall, right? So we see all of these hyper athletic tight ends kind of succeed, including guys that haven't played the position all that much, right? Like you see guys like Antonio Gates, Jimmy Graham just convert to the position. They're insanely just athletic from like a raw sense, and within a year or two of converting, they're leading all tight ends in fantasy points, right? And even kind of these hyper athletic tight ends that fall to day 2 are having similar outcomes to the ones that get drafted on day 1, right? Unfortunately, that isn't the case for this tight end class, it seems. We did the like Harold Fannin kind of ran a bit slower. He was fine, but not like a 90th percentile guy. Same with Oren Gadsden. We didn't see Elijah Arroyo test yet, unless his pro day was recently and I missed it. And then the top 2 guys haven't tested yet. But yeah, there are no like, I don't have like any actionable athleticism takes for this tight end class yet, because again, most of the good guys haven't tested or tested kind of average to okay. But yeah, just in general, hyper athletic tight ends, it is predictive of fantasy scoring.
Yeah, the more intuitive sense. You want the top potential breakout players or the top potential athletes. Okay, you gave me a great transition for off the rails, and it's very timely because back in 2002, and I grew up in Pittsburgh. I grew up a Pitt fan, and then the teams, the Charles Smith teams, broke my heart in the late 80s. early 90s. Then I went to Syracuse, and the 2003 Syracuse team, they made my day, my year. But I still carried a lot of loyalty to Pitt. In 2002, Pitt lost in the Sweet 16 to a Kent State team led by a power forward, one Antonio Gates. Hall of Famer, by the way, now Hall of Famer, Antonio Gates. March Madness, does it scratch any itches for you? That was my original first love in sports, was March Madness. What does March Madness do for you, Ryan?
Yeah, so I am not a college basketball fan, really. So I will watch March Madness. I'll always make a bracket that like I participate in that for sure. I'm not watching college basketball in December. Not
That's
will
right.
never pretend like I do that. I don't know about you. I find it, especially since I started doing this fantasy football stuff full time. I honestly find it hard to get invested in other sports because there's like that itch in me that's like if you pay attention to a sport, like you have to really know everything and like get as invested as you are in football. And I know I don't have like the time or energy to give like that to another sport. So yeah, I end up just being like a fair weather fan. I'm up in Boston, so like when the Celtics are in the playoffs, I'll watch them. And yeah, like the big events, March Madness and stuff, I will get invested in. But I guess kind of what it means to me is when I think of March Madness, I always think of this is kind of an odd, like little coincidence, but so I grew up in New Hampshire, very rural New Hampshire. Something that my family always did around this time of year, March Madness, is like tapping maple trees and making
Oh,
maple syrup, right?
wow.
So yeah, it's super cool. Yeah, you we would just go around, tap all these maple trees, like on like in the woods all over my parents and my grandparents' property, collect all these giant jugs of sap, like dump them into this little like sap house that we have with this like giant boiler. And we would just sit there for hours and hours and hours boiling sap, waiting for it to turn into maple syrup. And listening to March Madness like on this tiny little
Wow.
radio was what we had like before like my childhood before like
Sure.
smartphones and high speed internet and streaming and all of that. That's like what I think of March Madness as is like just listening on the radio. Which I sound like I'm 25. I shouldn't be talking about listening to sporting events on the radio, but yeah, that's like the memories I have of March Madness. And yeah, like filling out my brackets as a kid and like getting really excited in the sap house listening to it.
That's
So
awesome.
yeah, that's kind of what it means to me.
Okay, so I've got questions. First of all, so through that where you grew up, do you understand bears? Did you have to kind of get to know behavior of bears? Did you encounter bears? How did bears figure into your childhood?
I've never encountered a bear. Really, the bears that we have up in New England are like black bears. They're not like really the aggressive ones. So like I don't know. I was just always taught like if you see a bear, like make noise and walk
Right,
away.
right.
Basically, yeah,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
pretty much what it was. Yeah, I don't know that works with like the a grizzly bear or like the the bigger and scarier bears. But yeah, at least the ones we have up in New England, that's what you're supposed to do. At least is what I've been taught.
Yeah, there's a great a Twitter account called, I don't know if they're still active, but it was called A Single Bear, and it was just the thoughts of a bear, and it was really funny. I think they did T-shirts. I wanted to get one that said like I'm always like one of the bear's thoughts was I am always at least a little bit afraid, and yeah, absolutely. Like bears are they just want to be left alone. I mean, the black bears, they just want to be left alone. They're just we give them easy sources of food. So the other thing I want to ask you is having that in your childhood, has it just ruined maple syrup unless you have like the really good stuff? Can you even have like Aunt Jemima? Sorry, Aunt Jemima, I lost that sponsorship. Can you just not have other kinds of syrup, but the really good stuff straight from the tree?
Yeah, I don't drink fake maple syrup at all. Like I just will refuse to have it. And I mean my family always has like lots of real maple syrup. And in fact, tomorrow night I'm going down to boil sap with my dad
Oh,
like old times, and I'll probably pick up I'll probably take home some real maple syrup. But yeah, I just refuse to have any of the fake stuff. It's just it's not the same. It just tastes very like artificial.
right.
It's like I don't want to say it's like too sweet, because there's no, with maple syrup, there's no such thing as too sweet to me. Or in general, I love everything sweet, but it's just sweet in like a different way. It's
Hmm.
really hard for me to describe, but yeah, it just feels off. Yeah, you got to have the real stuff.
Yeah, well, I talk about this because living down here in New Orleans, with the amazing fertile soil of the Mississippi Delta, a lot of stuff grows really well here. So different times of year at the farmers markets, different seasons, and I think it's Baudrillard. I don't know if I'm saying it right, but there was like a linguist philosopher who talked about there's the thing, and then there's the simulation of the thing, and then there's the simulation of the simulation, the simulacrum. And a lot of things in our world are the simulation of the simulation, right? Like, and it's new too. I mean, for most of human existence, if you had syrup, it was like what you got to have, or you're going to get to have maple syrup. So, our something in us, I think, can recognize this isn't actually a real thing. This isn't maple syrup, um, and but only if you had the real thing. If you haven't had the real thing, you might think that what's in those bottles at the grocery store is maple syrup. It's not maple syrup. It just has the name maple syrup on it. You know what? It happened with me with strawberries down here. The Ponchatoula strawberries. I thought I had a strawberry, and then I had a real strawberry. And the other thing I want to say, I just want to give you props that you're going back there again this week, because I find I'm almost twice your age. Sorry, I'm almost twice your age, Ryan. And the kinds of experiences I think as people look back on their younger years that they wish they had done more of is going back home and doing the things that you did growing up. I wish I had gone back and done that again. I wish I had done that more often, because what you describe is just you spend time with each other. Wow, what a concept. What are some other things that you feel like you've really benefited from because you got to grow up in the woods of New Hampshire?
Oh man, yeah. Let's see. I don't know. So my like family's house growing up was literally in the woods. So it's like we had this long driveway that was probably 3/4 of a mile to like a mile long, where it's just like this dirt driveway that would loop back around like to the main road in kind of like a semicircle, that the house is like in there somewhere, probably
Yeah.
halfway through. And yeah, I just remember like riding bikes up and down that driveway constantly, like running around with the dogs and stuff. Me and my brother would always be out like climbing trees and like making forts and stuff. Like I don't know. I feel like maybe going back to what you're saying with the simulacrum of the simulacrum. There is kind of this thought that people express sometimes, which is like, oh, like like these kids don't have like childhoods anymore or whatever. Like they're on their iPads. They're not like going out and playing in the neighborhood, or like meeting other kids, or do like running up and down the blocks in the suburbs, or riding bikes, or any of that. But yeah, I feel like I got to do all that, even though it was super rural. It was just me and my brother. We didn't really have neighbors. But yeah, I feel like I did have like those real experiences, to where like hearing people talk about their idea of that type of experience that maybe they've never even actually like done in real life is like a really weird kind of full circle thing to me, that yeah, makes me really happy for my childhood and how I grew up.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing to be able to say, I hope everybody has at least something in their life they say, well, I got to do that. Because I do think something that's missing now is boredom. I mean, being bored as a kid is at the end of boredom is where you find out who you are. It's where you find out what turns you on, how you fit in this world. So the fact that all these devices, and I'm as guilty of it as anybody, keep us from getting bored, keep kids from getting bored, may keep them from finding out who they are. But we appreciate that when you're bored or to find out who you are, you come and spend time with us out there, folks. That you give us the opportunity, the privilege of providing the great fantasy analysis you get from Scott Barrett and Ryan Heath and everybody. Ryan J_Heath over there at Twitter. More great analysis and dank stats, and keep everyone keeping us company like we did today, like we did for each other, like you did for us always. Even though football's 6 months away, we love spending time with you because you are so classy.